Some moments are so heavy that history never really finds the proper words to describe them. September 1773, James Boone and Henry Russell had ridden ahead of the main party. The wilderness around them was quiet. It was peaceful until that moment when it wasn't, because a war party emerged from the trees. The two young men were quickly overtaken before help could reach them, and by the time the rest of the party arrived, it was over. Both James Boone and Henry Russell were dead. The journey into Kentucky ended where it might had barely begun, because the families all turned back. The wagons rolled east instead of west, and somewhere behind them, a father left the country that had taken his son. Some stories are remembered for what happened, others for the things that happened afterward. Human hurt. We all know what happened to James Boone, and we know that outcome caused Daniel Boone to abandon his first attempt to settle Kentucky. And we also know that nearly 2 years later, Daniel Boone would be back on the trail once more. But the reason that I added the extra log to the fire here at camp tonight is because there's a question that I seem to be wrestling with and trying very deliberately, both through the podcast and through my own journaling, to truly understand. And that is, what happened during the gap? What happened in that space in between the tragic death of James and the re-emergence of Boone? And I think, as a father, it's one of those things that you really struggle to truly understand, because when something of that magnitude happens, you find yourself as a father who had to decide, literally, what kind of man he was going to become after the event. It's impossible to ignore the fact that grief changes us. It changes the way that we see the world. It changes the way that we look at other people. Sometimes that change goes so deep that we never see ourselves the same way again. And if you live long enough, you know that there are losses that divide different aspects of your life into chapters. There's the before and the after. And I don't know what Daniel Boone thought on that ride back home, because history isn't able to tell us about that part. Maybe there was some kind of grief that just absolutely refuses to conform to words. But I do know this. Every father that's listening already understands something that the history pages could never record. That there are some losses that never leave your side. They simply become part of you. There are some losses that never leave your side. Those losses simply become a part of you. That's a very powerful thing to acknowledge and understand. I've often wondered if the hardest part wasn't about leaving Kentucky. Maybe the hardest part was knowing that every aspect of that new frontier would forever hold a place where James died. Every ridgeline of reminder, every creek of visual aid just poking itself at you, reminding you of the flow of life. Every timber stand, another simple reminder. Most of us would understand if Boone had never looked west again. And I don't think that any of us would have blamed him. In fact, it might be the decision that we would have expected from most anyone. But somewhere deep down inside, whether it was the things that the wilderness had already taught Daniel Boone, or just something that he was following on mere faith, that wasn't the moment where the story was meant to end. And that's part of the story that I found myself unable to ignore. Because the frontier, it was a violent place. It was a place where grief could easily become anger. And anger can spill over into revenge. History gives us countless examples of people who allowed tragedy to define the rest of their lives. And it would have been completely understandable if Boone had become one of them. But that's not the man that history remembers. Boone fought when he believed that there was no other choice. He fought to defend settlers. He survived along the frontier. Daniel Boone was very intimately related with first-hand violence. But the historical records don't reveal a man who was consumed by hatred. He continued to negotiate at any opportunity that he could. He continued to recognize that the humanity of the native people was just as important as the humanity of the settlers that were moving west. Even while living through one of the bloodiest periods of the American frontier, that doesn't erase the conflict. It doesn't erase the suffering of either side, but it does force me to ask a vital question here. Can grief exist without becoming hatred? I think, sure, maybe it can. But it's one of the hardest frontiers that any of us will ever have to cross. Because eventually, the wounds that we accumulate throughout our lives, they may not look the same way as they did back then. But eventually, we all have to accept the loss of someone in our family dying, a dream that falls apart, a diagnosis that changes everything, a betrayal that redraws the entire map. It's in those moments that we find ourselves standing at a crossroad. We have to decide, will the pain become that one thing that divides us, that defines who we are? Or will it simply become something that we carry without surrendering ourselves to it? I don't know exactly how Daniel Boone answered those questions, because history's not able to tell us that. But it tells us enough, because nearly 2 years later, he found his way back into Kentucky. Not because James was forgotten, because the cold hard truth is that a father never forgets. Not because the pain had disappeared. We all know that pain doesn't work that way. He returned because something inside of him refused to let that grief have the final word. And maybe, just maybe, that was Daniel Boone's greatest act of courage. Not surviving the wilderness, not exploring Kentucky, not even returning. Maybe his greatest act of courage was refusing to become someone else because of what the wilderness had taken from him. Next time, we'll follow Boone back into Kentucky. We'll walk beside the man who returned to the very country that had broken his heart. And we'll discover why history enthusiasts entrusted him with opening the wilderness road. Until next time, my friend, if anything in this episode has intrigued your interest, I feel free to swing over to projectmindfulloutdoors.com, where you can find out more about my upcoming book, The Honest Wilderness, Finding Daniel Boone and the Frontier Within. So until we meet again, get out there in the wilderness. That's where the stillness and the adventure is meant to be lived. See ya.